Saturday at 5. He was just jamming the second leg into the stiff jeans when his thinking was stopped, and almost his heart, by a high-pitched scream. He knew the sound, had heard it before. It was either a bobcat or a mountain lion. He couldn't tell which. But it didn't matter. It came from up the side of the canyon, above the sheep, and he looked up to see roughly 6,000 sheep coming straight at him at a dead run. There's no room, he thought, not for all of you to be in camp. We just don't have the room. And they were over him. He stood and braced his legs, and they tried to go around him. But they were panicking and wide-eyed, snorting snot, bleeding, and many of them ran into him, and he knew he could never stand. He'd never heard of anybody being killed in a sheep stampede, but he didn't want to try to be the first. He saw that Pete had run under the wagon, and he made a dive for the small space, bounded off woolly backs, went down, staggered back up, and scrambled in next to Pete, around in the back of the wheel, while the sheep ran over and around everything else. My clothes. When the massive running sheep hit the willows, they went down, and John's clothes went with them, churned into the ground by thousands of feet. In less than a minute, it was finished. All the sheep and lambs had crossed the stream, and the front of the herd was grazing peacefully on the opposite side of the canyon from the stream. There was no second scream. John crawled out from under the wagon. It was probably a bobcat. The lions were usually higher, and if so, there was little danger. Lions killed sheep, but the smaller bobcats would only take the lambs when they were very small and alone. They almost never bothered adult sheep or protected lambs. It was probably just marking its territory, but the damage was done. The camp was a shambles, or actually he thought it looked very neat, almost swept. The box of medicines had been tipped and everything scattered and driven into the dirt. The steps were carried off the wagon and broken apart, the boards thrown every which way. He found a shirt and pants after some searching, and almost threw the shirt away. The pants, being heavier material, had come through with just a few small cuts. The shirt was of thinner cloth and was literally in shreds, but he had brought only 3 work shirts for the whole summer and 1 lined jacket, 3 pairs of pants, so he decided to keep the shirt, for rags if nothing else. His saddle had been on the ground next to the wagon and had been tossed sideways, but he'd always kept it oiled and pliable, and the leather was tough. It had not been hurt. The wagon had remained upright, and everything inside it was all right. It could be worse, he said, and looked around to see that Pete had torn the bandages off his foot, had chewed through the twine holding him to the wagon, and was limping back to the herd to help the other 3 dogs. Pete, come here. The dog stopped, looked at John, wagged his tail, looked at the sheep, then back at John once more, then back to the sheep, and he looked again toward the herd, and John couldn't stop him. He stood holding his rags, the camp in shambles, and he couldn't stop the dog and realized he had no control over anything. Chapter 13. The day passed somehow with nothing truly getting done. He found some saddle oil in a box in the trailer and cleaned and oiled his saddle and put it under the wagon. Then he started to unload and rearrange the inside of the wagon so that he could sleep there for the night, and he found a needle and thread and tried to patch his shirt and pants in some way. The whole day went that way, one thing to another until it was dark and he really couldn't see that anything was done. Even the wagon wasn't squared away. The bunk was clear, but the rest of it was still a shambles, and when dark came he lighted the lantern, hung it from the bow, holding the canvas up, and sat in the yellow grill and ate a can of cold beef stew with a metal spoon. He caught himself starting to wipe the spoon on his pants leg, smiled and went outside and washed it in the stream, using sand to clean it and rinsing it when it was spotless. He went to bed, not so much because he was tired, as to get away from the day, his first day, and he was nearly asleep when he remembered he hadn't put down dog food. He climbed out barefoot and put a pan down, kicking himself mentally for being so stupid. All 4 of the dogs were there to eat, sitting watching him, waiting for the food, and he relighted the lantern and used the light to examine Pete's foot. The pad had already worked back into place and seemed to be sticking there, healing in. It was impossible, but it was there. He touched it and Pete jerked his paw away, went back to eating, and when he was done, he returned to the herd at a run. He still limped, but he was moving better, and John went back to sleep, wondering how it could begin to heal that fast. The first smash of thunder awakened him, seemed to come from inside him. It was close, so close he could smell the stink of burned air, and he was sitting up, awake, before he realized what had done it. He knew mountain thunder was worse, because you were right inside it, right in the clouds, and he'd heard it before, but it still surprised him to be in the middle of a storm. Lightning came fast for 7 or 8 minutes, seemed to smack back and forth across the valley from peak to peak and into the trees, and was followed instantly and almost continuously by the thunder, and made so bright he could have almost read. And loud. It actually thunders, he thought, jumping into the wagon and opening the door to watch. He could see the sheep in the constant blue light, and they were afraid, were milling and bleating, though he couldn't hear them well. The dogs were working the edges of the herd restlessly, except for Jenny. He couldn't find Jenny. Jenny! He called her name several times, but she was nowhere near the herd. Only 3 dogs were there. Then she showed. She was under the wagon and came out slowly, her tail down, her ears laid back. Jenny, what's the matter? She was terrified of the thunder, stiff with fear. Well, it is scary, isn't it? It was starting to rain, and she looked so bedraggled, so afraid and lonely, that he smiled. Why don't you come on in? He motioned with his hands, and she was inside the trailer in part of a second, almost knocking him down. She jumped on the cot, curled up halfway up from the bottom, and tucked her nose under her tail. I see, he said. You must have done this with Tink. He smiled. Well, I guess it's all right. John slid inside the bag, stretching his legs past the sleeping dog, and blew the lantern out by raising the globe and blowing across the top. But the light from the lightning kept a dim blue glow going inside the trailer for a long time, and just when it seemed to be stopping, the lightning cutting back, the rain started. It was not hard at first, but grew in intensity until it drummed on the waterproof tarp so that he could not hear himself think. He sat up, lighted the lantern, but everything, for a change, seemed to be all right. The tarp was not leaking except for a small drip around the chimney hole, but that was nothing. Even as he watched the yellow light making jumping shadows jump, the rain and noise let off, and the storm moved up the canyon, back up into the mountains, where it belongs, John thought, throwing the lantern on again and lying back in bed. He closed his eyes and waited for sleep, but it didn't come. Something was working at him, bothering him, and he couldn't pin it down. Something about the storm. He waited, let his mind wander, but nothing came, and finally his eyes closed and went to sleep with his hand on Jenny's forehead. Chapter 14. John's eyes were open and he was sitting up, but he couldn't think why he was awake. It was pitch dark and totally silent. Even the sheep were quiet, down for the night. John found his digital watch and pushed the illuminating button. 3 a.m. No sound, not even night sounds. Jenny had been asleep, and when he raised, she did the same. Raised her head and looked at him. The storm is over, he said, way off now. But he was awake. Miles away in the mountains, he heard faint rumbling. Why am I awake? Jenny moved from the bed, stretched, and went to the door of the trailer. Back to work, eh? He dropped his feet to the floor, and padded to the small door, let her out, then stood for a moment on the steps, listening, waiting. For what? There was nothing wrong. Overhead, the sky was brilliantly clear. While there was no moon, the stars splashed across the sky and gave enough light so that he could see the sheep, bedded, sleeping, or watching him. Jenny trotted off silently in the edge of the herd and sat, watching, waiting. For what? It was there. Something was there, but he couldn't for the life of him think of anything wrong, anything that needed doing. He shook his head, shrugged, and returned to the trailer. The night was cold. He had seen his breath when he was standing on the steps, and the sleeping bag was still warm. He zipped it up to his shoulder and lay, still awake, thinking. Something bothered him. Was it the sheep? The dogs? No, it was all right. Everything was all right. It was just the day, he finally decided. It had been a rough first day, and the hangover from it was bothering him. Maybe tomorrow would be better, and he could settle in. He closed his eyes, and sleep started to come, and just there, just between being awake and being asleep, he almost thought he was dreaming it. He heard a faint sound. Nearly thunder. Maybe that was it. It was so warm in the bag that he was so sleepy, and the sound was so faint he thought it was more of the storm up in the mountains, far-off rumbling of clouds bumping in the peaks. What had his father said that time? Oh yeah, the devil bowling. The thunder was the devil bowling up in the mountains. It was something his grandfather had said, and before him his great-grandfather. The thunder was the devil bowling up in the peaks, but there was something else, something to do with the sound he was hearing. It was getting louder now, still faint, but growing. A larger hissing to it, and a rumble. Something to do with the thing his father had said about the mountains. The mountains and rain. It was still louder, crashing sound to it, and he knew suddenly what it was. What was coming. What was already here. A flash flood. The heavy rain had moved on up the canyon, but it had kept raining up into the higher canyon still, and they all fed this one. This canyon that he was in, with the sheep, formed a giant bowl to catch water, not just from rain, but from other canyons as well, washing down the slopes of the valleys and canyons, filling small streams, and all the streams emptied into this one main stream, going by right next to the cabin. He was sitting up, and as he reached for the zip around the bag, the first wall of water tore past the wagon. For a moment he felt relief. The wagon was above the cut bank of the stream bed. It stood 4 or 5 feet high, and from the sound of it all, the water seemed to be roaring past well inside the stream bed, easily contained. But the wagon was on the outside edge of a curve made of soft dirt and gravel, and the wall of water hit it, bounced off and away to the side with tremendous force. He was up out of the bag and opened the small door, caught one glimpse of the water foaming downstream in the starlight, turned to see if the sheep were all right. The dogs had them well up and away from the stream bed. When the water cut the dirt away and the bank gave way beneath the wagon, there was a small lurch, and John actually looked down at the floor by his feet, as if expecting to see the reason, and then it was gone. The part of the bank supporting the 2 right wheels of the wagon gave way completely. The wagon fell sideways, rolling as it went, and landed on its side in the water. John had not completely unloaded the wagon yet, and boxes of canned goods tumbled over to the side, making the downside heavier. The wagon didn't slow when it hit the surface, but continued over and down until it was three-fourths of the way over to upside down. The end wall on the front of the wagon was made up of canvas to keep out wind and rain. It was nothing to a 6-foot rip of current, moving at 30 miles an hour, and popped loose almost as instantly. The giving of the canvas probably saved John's life, although he didn't have time to feel grateful. When the wagon had tumbled, the door opening end had kicked slightly up and knocked John back into the wagon. He had time to suckle just one breath, and he was covered with cans of beef stew and pork and beans and chili and close to a ton of water that had come swirling in around the canvas when the top started under. He would have drowned there, tangled in his own bedding and food, except that when the surge blew in the end of the wagon, it turned the hole inside into something close to a tube. With the door already open, because he had been looking outside, there was nothing to stop the water, and it blew through the wagon with a large whooshing sound. John later thought it must have been like getting flushed down a giant toilet, carrying everything that was inside the trailer out the back end, including John. He shot out through the door at nearly current speed, from a dead stop to 30 miles an hour at 8 or 9 feet, and roared downstream like a runaway train. As he went through the door, his head hit the top, which was now the side, and it momentarily stunned him. This added to the confusion of being suddenly tumbled, and he was for a few seconds overcome by vertigo. He had no idea which way was up, and he kept pulling and pulling, trying to get to the surface, only to finally realize that he was swimming down, not up. The water was not deep, and there were no boulders, but there were hundreds of other objects caught in the water, logs and limbs from trees, and gear from the wagon, all his gear from the wagon. He kept hitting things, coming up under them. Once he thought he was breaking free, only to find that his face was coming up inside heavy, wet cloth, and realized he was under the sleeping bag. He broke loose, caught a breath, and then another, and was immediately slammed sideways into a bank as the steam curved. Oof! The blow knocked the wind out of him, and was followed by another hit, as a floating pine snag ran into him and smashed him once more into the bank. Get away! He screamed, and kicked at the dead tree, as if it were an enemy. Branches tangled around him, and he fought savagely for 2 or 3 seconds, then realized he could simply push it away. As soon as he drew free of the snag, the current took him again, and he moved downstream 200 yards before his clawing hands found an aspen trunk along the edge, and he stopped himself. He hung for a moment, getting his breath and strength back, then pulled up onto the bank and dragged himself well away from the rushing water. He felt pummeled, beaten, and he sat curled in a ball with his face on his knees, dazed, still confused. Something came next to him, and he opened one eye to see Jenny standing there. He could just see her face in the darkness, and she studied his eyes. "All right," he mumbled, "I'm all right." But it was a lie, and he knew it, and so did Jenny. He wasn't hurt bad physically, bruises and some scratches, but most definitely not all right. Jenny sat next to him, leaned against his leg, propped her head on his arm, and whined. "It's all right," he repeated, dropping his hand to her head and neck, petting her. "Just a little rest now, and it'll be all right." He closed his eyes. Chapter 15. He did not sleep, but a kind of rest took him. Some time later, still before daylight, he heard or felt the water going down again, and raised his eyes to see that it dropped almost as fast as it had risen. In seeming minutes, it was back to a small, peaceful, meandering stream moving through a meadow on a high mountain peak. Like a snake, he thought, raised and hit and gone. He tried to see his watch, but it had been smashed when he blew out of the wagon, and it didn't work. It didn't matter. Time didn't matter. Nothing much mattered any longer. He was done. The day had whipped him. One day, the old man had come into this country with 2 horses and a gun. His old father had taken the herd all summer when he was a boy, and John made one day, and he had a dead sheep, an injured dog, and his camp gone. Not just wrecked, but gone, somewhere downstream. Daylight came slowly. John sat and watched the eastern sky over the canyon mouth grow faintly gray, then a little more, then brighter, until he could see around him. He thought of leaving. He thought his saddle must still be where it had been. The wagon had tipped off, but the saddle had been sitting on the ground and might still be there. He could saddle Speck or Spud and say to heck with it and ride home. It would take a long day or a little more, and he'd be in his room in dry clothes, and everything would be all right, except the sheep and the dogs. Yes, he thought, there was that, wasn't there? He couldn't leave and couldn't stay, and he couldn't do anything right. When it was light enough to see where he was walking so he wouldn't step on a snake, he stood like a rusty hinge opening and started to make his way barefoot and half naked. He was wearing his pants, which he'd been sleeping in, but no shirt, back to the campsite, or where the campsite had been. The wreckage was complete. His saddle was still there, along with the bridle and rope, and the box of medicine for the dogs and sheep. There were also 2 boxes of gear and a soaked bag of dog food that he'd taken out of the wagon. He couldn't even see the wagon at first, not until he'd walked almost to the edge of the stream. Ah, he thought of about 6 choice words the collie or his dad would have used and wondered why he didn't swear. The wagon was on its side in the stream, but the stream bed was deeper than it had been before. When the flash flood came down, it gouged and raked away the bottom and bank to deepen the bed, and the wagon had settled over on its side until the top was angled downward and the wheels stuck up in the air. It looked hopeless. The stream had dropped back to 5 or 6 inches, rambling through a gravel bed, and it seemed that a garbage truck had dumped its load along the bed. Cans of food, parts of bedding, paper. The paper seemed incredible, scattered by bits by the hundreds, and he couldn't think how he could have brought so much paper until he saw that all the cans had lost the labels. The water had washed off all the paper labels and scattered them along the stream bed. Junk, he thought. It just looked like junk. Trash. My trash. And it's all I've got, he said to Jenny. My own private trash. He went to the saddle. It was wet, as were the saddle blanket and bridle, but the sun was well up now, and it looked to be a clear day, and things would dry fast. Maybe too fast. He worried that the leather in the saddle would crack if it dried too fast, and he pulled it into the shade of the willows. He picked a flat place near the same willows out in the sun and started gathering all that he could find. The force of water had not only pushed him out of the wagon, but virtually everything else. He crawled inside the overturned wagon and fished out what was left. The harness for Spack and Spud were still there. They had tangled on their hooks and had been held in place. But the collars, the thick padded collars that went around the horses' necks and took the strain of the load, were both gone. He put the harnesses, they were very old and well oiled, but were made of leather, back in the willows with the saddle to dry slowly. He found one boot, almost immediately, just downstream from the wagon. At least, he said to Jenny, I can hop around. In a short time he found there was some logic to the destruction. At first look, the current had seemed just to flush everything away, but the stream wound severely as it moved through the flat of the meadow, and in each turn it had cut into a bank. As it cut and was forced to turn, the water dropped much of what it was carrying. The part of each turn where the water surged and was forced around proved to be a treasure trove. He found most of his lost canned goods in the other boot on the second turn down from the wagon. There was also 1 sack of dog food. The paper of the bag was soaked through, and he feared the dog food would be ruined, but the manufacturer had thought to put in a plastic liner, and it had been not torn. His pile grew steadily. He found 2 boxes of ammunition, but could not find the rifle. It didn't seem possible that the steel of the 30-30 would let it be taken downstream very far, but he combed the stream bed for it without success. The rest of his canned goods, or so it seemed, he couldn't be sure, he found in the second and third beds, and the dog food snacks were there as well. One of them had been slashed open by a snag, and the dog food that hadn't spilled was soaked. He carried it carefully to the pile. They could eat it first, wet, and maybe that way he wouldn't lose so much. The search for food took most of the day. In the middle of the afternoon he stopped to eat. He had found his spoon, but couldn't find the can opener. Still, he had his pocket knife, and he went to the pile of canned goods. Without labels, it was a gamble. He picked a short, stout can that he thought would have beef stew. There were many beef stews, and he wound up having a spaghetti and meatball lunch. For dessert, he opened a can he thought would have been fruit cocktail, and it proved to contain stewed tomatoes. He didn't remember packing stewed tomatoes. He didn't even like stewed tomatoes, but he ate them and tried without much luck to make believe they tasted like fruit cocktail. He worked until dark, and by then he thought he had everything, or at least everything there was to find. He'd even found the horse collars, not 20 yards apart, hung on snags. The rifle still eluded him, and the wagon was still in the stream, but there wasn't much else missing. He had a stroke of luck. A tree limb snag had jammed across the stream bed a quarter of a mile below the wagon, and the branches had formed a mesh net across the flow of water. His sack of extra clothing and the sleeping bag hung up on the mesh. Had they not caught there, floating as they did, he figured they could have gone to Casper, a couple of 100 miles away. At dark he set up a crude camp. He had found the plastic bag of matches. Tink had taught him that, and he made a fire. His sleeping bag was still wet, but his jacket was dry, as were his clothes, which he'd hung over the willows. He lay next to the fire and settled back to spend the second night, leaning forward now and then to feed a piece of wood to the fire to keep it going. He had remembered about the horse, about keeping horse to hand, and he had Speck tethered to the long rope. She could graze and reach water, but she was also close if he needed her. Spud didn't want to be too far from her, so he stayed near camp as well, and John listened to them rumble and chew and thought that it must not have been so different when the old man had come with his 2 horses. I wonder if he had dogs, John thought dreamily, on the edge of sleep. Nobody ever said if he had a dog with him. Maybe he had a dog or 2. Maybe he camped right here, right on this spot. He let sleep take him in fits and started, dreaming about his father and the old man and 2 horses and the fire, all mixed together, not really hard sleeping. At 2 in the morning, with a sliver of moon starting to show, the coyotes hit the herd.